In my previous lesson, I talked about my dream educational endeavor and how toxicity impacted my work. I decided to leave that project, and it was a watershed moment in my personal and professional growth. I had made a realistic read of the institution that it wasn't going to improve its organizational culture. I kept reminding myself that it was a healthy move for me to make. I moved back to my home city of Chennai. I felt burnt out and disillusioned about educational institutions, and I needed time to heal from working in that toxic environment. Admitting this to myself and my family was a significant act of leaning into vulnerability. My family was empathic and supportive of my decision, and to think I had stopped myself from sharing about my work struggles for almost a year, fearing that they'd think less of me. Moving back to my home city provided a surprising added advantage. When I got back in touch with old friends, I discovered that many of them were on similar life journeys as I was, cutting through the clutter of normative ideas to figure out what was truly important to them personally and professionally. And what we all ended up realizing was that our top priority was well being. What was common to all our journeys was all the shame we realized we held about so many things, like leaving a job, staying in a dysfunctional or unhappy relationship, and feeling exhausted about parenting, to name a few. After these realizations, one of my friends who had come across Brené Brown suggested that we do a weekly reading circle with one of her books titled, I Thought It Was Just Me, But It Isn't, Making the Journey from What Will People Think to I Am Enough. We met for a couple of hours every week and read through the book, slowly and deliberately, stopping to share anecdotes and examples that helped us unpack insights from the book. This was a powerful experience. Here we were, a group of 5 or 6 women who had committed to sharing our worries and fears, insecurities and hopes, all in service of understanding how shame and vulnerability affects us. Many of us in the group were former educators as well. True to the book's title, through these conversations, each of us began to truly see that it wasn't just me. All of us wrestled with shame in one area of our lives or the other, and we began to see that the work cut out for us was indeed, as the second part of the book's title suggested, to stop worrying about how we are seen by others and accept ourselves for who we are. By talking, sharing, and processing together in a group week after week, many of our individual vulnerabilities became fodder for reflection for others in the group. By helping one another reframe anxieties, neuroses, and sorrows, we found ways to shift out of our own. I received permission from one of my friends from the group to share her story. This friend, I'll call her Priya, told us how ashamed she felt about yelling at her kids. She considered herself a patient parent, but recently she'd been getting shot with them quite often. The yelling wasn't abusive screaming or angry shouting, mind you, but she'd noticed that she was raising her voice more often when issuing instructions or reprimanding her children. Of course, Priya knew she was tired and overworked. She was juggling the stress of a full-time job and parenting 2 children. And occasionally, an impatient instruction delivered in a higher than usual volume is natural and forgivable. But knowing this didn't do anything to stem the shame she felt. Together, we helped her get to the bottom of this shame. She came from a family where there were no yellers. Even an expression of exasperation was considered yelling. So, from pretty early on, she worked very hard to cope with stressful situations, unfortunately in unhealthy ways, lest she let go and yell. In her mind, not sharing her stresses was a part of keeping the approval and connection with her parents. Something very interesting happened as we were processing this in the group. Another mother, I'll call her Leela, became aware that she shames people when they are stressed. It wasn't something she did overtly, but she certainly judged them heavily for it. When Priya shared her experiences and we helped her process it, Leela began to wonder if she too grew up in an environment that frowned upon sharing about stresses. These realizations showed the power of vulnerability in action. Talking about and allowing others to witness our vulnerability was making us authentic with ourselves and each other. In Brown's words, vulnerability is the core, the heart, the center of meaningful human experiences. And we were beginning to see that. The authenticity, basically just being real, was making our conversations more meaningful. We were learning from each other and shifting patterns and mindsets. We were not posturing, virtue signaling, or trying to be one up on each other. Removing your protective armor can sometimes feel like a foolhardy move, leaving you open to getting hurt. But what it actually does is brings us closer together, inspiring connection and confidence. Being in the group meant that each of us had to consciously put aside defensiveness we had built up to cover our anxiety and fear. What started as a reading circle that ended up being a kind of emotional laboratory, a safe space in which to experiment, model, and practice ways to avoid giving into shame, developing shame resilience, in the words of Brené Brown. Of course, change is gradual, and even within this space, there were times when we fell back into old patterns. In the process of helping someone in the group deconstruct or reframe aspects or causes of shame, someone would unwittingly end up shaming that person. That's how pervasive shaming is. It's so unconscious and innocuous that we don't realize we're doing it sometimes. I'll give you an example. One of the women we'll call Maya was coming out of a long stretch of at-home parenting and preparing to re-enter the workforce. She was anxious about her skills being obsolete and was wondering if she should switch career tracks or get some training. To this, another member in the group, we'll call her Neha, said, "You're overthinking and complicating this. I think you're used to a lot of intense thinking. You should just relax." While this was uttered most gently and was well-intentioned, it ended up shaming Maya. But practicing the skills of leaning into vulnerability equipped Maya with a tool she needed to avoid being silenced or shrinking from shame. She drew on everything we had read in the book and she practiced shame resilience. She said, "Thank you, Neha, for suggesting that I should not stress about the decision. However, it seems like you're saying that it's not okay for me to feel anxious. Also, it makes me feel ashamed about my style and process of decision making." A simple statement, but it was a huge step for Maya. She found the courage to speak up for herself and draw a boundary, letting Neha know how her statement felt to hear. This was a huge step for Neha too. It made her think about whether she was truly respectful of the diversity that exists in the way people approach and make decisions. Through this interaction, Maya and Neha had been nudged into a shift, and that shift led to growth. Maya was getting more comfortable advocating for herself. Neha really began to assess if she was the cool, chill person she considered herself to be. If you've ever felt lonely or isolated, you've probably heard advice to go out and forge connections with people. It seems like simple enough advice, but this can be a harrowing proposition if everyone you meet looks like they have their act together all the time, unruffled and completely in control of their lives and emotions. In fact, this kind of inauthentic connection would only serve to increase your feelings of loneliness because while you have ostensibly connected with someone else, you feel even more alone in your beautiful messiness. Committing to vulnerability as individuals and as a society makes it possible for friends and family to approach us regardless of how much of a mess we feel like, and vice versa. We are wired to be socially connected, to belong. In Brené Brown's words, connection is why we are here. It is what gives purpose to our lives. A lot of research has established that social relationships benefit health. Social links are associated with better cardiovascular health, better nervous system regulation, and better recovery from certain diseases, to name a few. Now, can you imagine relationships between invulnerable people being pleasant, let alone being authentic? I'd imagine there'd be a lot of posturing and defensiveness. On the other hand, a relationship that has two people embracing vulnerability would mean them both having real data to work with. They'd each know what the other's actual thoughts and feelings are, not what sounds like the winning statement of the moment. Because for them, not knowing or feeling negative or ambiguity or any other states that we often feel we need to cover up is okay. In this way, vulnerability improves the quality of our relationships by increasing the capacity for interpersonal authenticity. In her TED talk, The Price of Invulnerability, Brené Brown mentions that as a society, we're losing our tolerance for vulnerability. She explains that the thing about vulnerability is that it is at the core of fear, anxiety, and shame, but it's also the birthplace of joy, of love, of belonging, of creativity, of faith. This resonates with me deeply. I feel that when I lean into my vulnerability, I'm also put in touch with feelings of anxiety and shame. And when that happens, I feel like leaning away from vulnerability. But that invulnerability leads to something quite awful, a creeping lack of empathy, a hardening within. That hardening, I have come to recognize, is what is asked of us when we are told to toughen up. So, can you imagine a society that comprises of people that lean away from vulnerability? Because let's face it, shame and anxiety are not fun. That invulnerability at a larger cultural level can have significant effects on the well being of individuals and societies because it dents our capacity for empathy at a systemic level. As we conclude this lesson, I invite you to think about how being vulnerable has impacted you. How do you feel about yourself when you are vulnerable? What do relationships give you when you and the other person are vulnerable with each other? Try to take a few minutes to reflect on and perhaps even write down detailed responses to these questions. Thinking about the role vulnerability plays in your life will help you become conscious about the specific ways that it impacts your well being and, by extension, the well being of your communities. In the final lesson of this course, I'll show you how to get hands on about vulnerability and discover why vulnerability can make you more creative and make leaders more accessible.